Chapter 4: The Spindle and the Loom. Why does man need clothes? Man is the only living thing that makes and wears clothing. The animals, as we have seen, do not need any additional protection against the weather. The first clothing that people wore consisted of leaves and bark, or, in colder regions, the skins of wild animals. One of the first tools that the men of the Stone Age made was the scraper, a sharp-edged stone tool which was used for scraping the skins of animals killed in the hunt after the meat had been eaten. In order to make the skin suitable for clothing, it was necessary to scrape off the bits of flesh clinging to the inside. Then, in order to make the skin soft, they were rubbed with fat. Later, they were hung over the fire and smoked, thus making them dry and durable, like leather. The American Indians made a beautiful, soft material out of deer skin, with which they fashioned warm, comfortable clothing, as well as moccasins. What was the first clothing material? Animal skins, however, must be tanned in order to make real leather. In the manufacture of leather, all the hairs, of course, are first scraped off the hide, which is then soaked in certain chemicals made from the barks of trees. The ancient Egyptians knew how to tan skins, and some very fine leather has been found in their tombs. Leather is the strongest of all materials for clothing, and leather coats and trousers are still worn by cowboys and other men engaged where the work is hard on clothing. And of course, leather is still used everywhere for shoes. Furs also are much used. But skins, furs, and leather are too hot for comfort in warm or temperate weather as regular clothing, and they cause an unpleasant feeling when worn next to one's own skin. Woven cloth has been found more suitable. We do not know when or where weaving was first invented. So many different peoples all over the world have been acquainted with the art of weaving that it may have been invented in more than one place. How is cloth made? The first step in producing cloth is to make thread. This can be obtained from many kinds of fiber, both animal and vegetable. The fibers are pulled out and twisted together. Twisting threads entirely by hand, however, is slow and awkward work. The ancient Egyptians thousands of years ago invented a machine for spinning thread. Such a machine is called a spindle. It is one of a man's most important inventions, and as we are constantly noticing in the case of other inventions, it grew out of something that was already known and in use. How is spinning done? The ancient Egyptian spindle was a tapering reel to which the thread was attached. There was a sort of knob in the middle to make it rotate easily, and a notch at the top in which the thread was caught while being twisted. The person doing the spinning held under the left arm or stuck in the belt a stick or staff upon which a bundle of fibers was bound. This was called the distaff. The operator drew out one after another the fibers from this bundle and fed them to the spindle, to which a twirling motion was given as it hung free by a twist of the operator's hand. Thus, the fibers were twisted and the operator wound them upon the spindle. The next step forward in spinning was the invention of the spinning wheel. Spinning wheels were used in India by early people. They first appeared in Europe during the Middle Ages. The spinning wheel was simply a mechanical means for making the spindle rotate more rapidly and continuously. A large wheel was attached to the spindle by a band. The operator turned the wheel with her left hand, and thus the spindle, which was set in a frame, was made to rotate swiftly. Another great improvement came into use about the year 1530, when a treadle was added to the spinning wheel. The operator could now use her foot for making the spindle rotate, and thus she had both her hands free for handling the fibers, and she could pull out 2 fibers at the same time. The distaff containing the fibers was attached to the frame. The rotating of the spindle twisted the thread, which was then wound up on a bobbin. What is a spinster? Until about the beginning of the 19th century, nearly every family kept a spinning wheel. Spinning was the work of girls and women, and as spinning was practically the only work left for a woman to engage in if she did not marry, any unmarried woman came to be called a spinster. In 1767, an Englishman named James Hargreaves invented a machine called the spinning jenny, in which a number of spindles were turned by a wheel, and many threads were spun at the same time. Other spinning machines were invented later by Arkwright and by Crompton. The machine of Crompton was improved until it operated 100 spindles. It was called a mule, because it was an offshoot of the spinning jenny. Then, when the steam engine was invented, steam became the power for running these machines. Hundreds of spindles could thus be operated at the same time, and large factories or mills were built to house the machines and the workers. When driven by machinery, the spindles revolved so swiftly that they made over 10,000 turns a minute. What is weaving? We must now go back and see how cloth was being woven. Weaving is another of the great inventions of our ancestors thousands of years ago. The ancient Egyptians, the Chinese, and in America, the Aztecs and Peruvians were skillful weavers. Before people began to weave cloth, they had the idea of weaving. You have all seen matting. Even uncivilized tribes have known how to make matting. It is made out of strips of grass or straw, plaited together by hand, one set of strips passing over and under the other set, which are laid crosswise to the first set. How did weaving start? Now, the weaving of cloth was only a short step from the plaiting of matting. There had to be two sets of thread or yarn. One set was called the warp, and the cross threads, which had to be worked in and out through the threads of the other set, were called the woof. In the earliest looms, the warp threads were stretched out side by side and close together on a frame. Then the weaver worked in the woof threads. This was done either with the fingers or by means of a stick held in the hand. Every other warp thread had to be lifted up separately. This method was slow, and it would take hours to make even a very small piece of cloth. What is a loom? The next invention, which saved an enormous amount of time and labor, was the use of crossbars, which in one movement lifted every other thread of the warp. Then the woof thread could be placed directly across the warp threads. When this was done, the bar was lowered, and the same operation was repeated with the other set of warp threads. Another time-saving invention was the shuttle. This was a heavy weight to which the woof thread was attached, and it was thrown swiftly across the warp threads when the bar was lifted up. This was the kind of loom that was used for hundreds of years until the beginning of modern times. Then came another improvement. This was the flying shuttle. The shuttle was thrown across the warp by levers instead of by the weaver's hand. This made it possible to do the work more rapidly. In the year 1784, an Englishman named Arkwright invented the power loom, which was made of cast iron and was operated by machinery. The coming of the steam engine turned weaving, like spinning, into a large-scale industry carried on in great factories or mills. What good is sewing? Closely connected with spinning and weaving, there is another and a still older invention which is necessary to the other two, and that is sewing. Cloth would not be of much use if there were not some way of neatly joining together pieces of different shapes and sizes in order to make a garment. The tool with which sewing is done is a needle, to which is attached a piece of thread. Even the most uncivilized tribes usually know how to sew, as did the men of the Stone Age thousands of years ago. The first needles were sharp thorns and narrow pieces of bone, and the first thread was strips of fiber, or slender pieces of sinew from the bodies of animals. The earliest needles did not have holes in the end, called eyes, through which the thread passed. The needles were used simply for pushing the thread through holes which had been cut in the pieces of skin that were to be fastened together. But the needle's eye was invented many thousands of years ago, for bone needles with eyes have been found among the tools left by the Stone Age men in Europe. Later, when metalworking was invented, needles were fashioned of bronze and eventually of fine steel. What use is the eye of the needle? When eyes were cut in the needle, it was no longer necessary to punch a series of holes in the material that was to be sewn and then push the thread through. The sharp point of the needle was simply run through the skin or cloth, first on one side and then on the other, and as it went through, it pulled the thread after it. Sewing was usually done by women, and a woman who sewed was called a seamstress. Sewing everything by hand was not an easy task and was tiresome work. As early as 1790, a machine for sewing was invented by an Englishman named Thomas Saint, which had some of the parts that we see in a sewing machine today. In 1830, a Frenchman named Timonier built a better machine. Who invented the sewing machine? It was not until 1846, however, when Elias Howe, an American, patented a new and improved machine that the real history of the sewing machine begins. In Howe's machine, the needle, which was curved, had the eye near the point, and it made a lock stitch by means of a shuttle on the other side of the cloth, the needle working horizontally. Other inventors made various improvements, and in 1851, a man named Isaac M. Singer brought out a machine operating with a vertical needle and with power supplied by a foot treadle. These early machines could do only simple stitching. Since then, machines have been built with special attachments for doing all sorts of sewing such as embroidery, buttonhole making, hemming, tucking, and darning. Machines also have been made for sewing leather and carpet. The machine for sewing leather was a great help in shoemaking. Many sewing machines nowadays are run by electricity.